Hello everyone, I'm Melissa Burke. I work with Christina in Australian Biocommons, but today I'm here on behalf of the FAIR training community and I'm going to provide a bit of an update on the different events that have been happening in this space over the last year or so. So I think it is fair to say that this community recognises the importance of sharing training materials and also the importance of sharing them in a consistent way if we're to get the most out of them. So the community's been discussing this for a while, and we've realised that the FAIR principles that were developed for data can provide a framework for sharing training materials. These discussions about adapting the FAIR training principles started to happen in one of the Elixir all hands meetings in around 2017, 2018, and continued on in the Elixir Fair Training Working Group, ultimately leading to the publication of the 10 Simple Rules for Making Training Materials Fair paper, which came out last year. So this is the figure from the paper, which gives you kind of overview of what those 10 simple rules are. I'm not going to go through that today, but I have put a link down here on the slide if you'd like to read it in more detail. So since the paper has been published, it's been really encouraging to see the community really grab hold of this concept and run with it and start to use the 10 simple rules in their own work and in sharing their training materials. Alongside that, there's also been a lot of events and get-togethers where the community's been able to come together and share their approaches and their ideas and their kind of grumbles about this approach as well. So this year alone, these are some of the events that have happened. We've had the Seneca Fair Hackathon, the Education Summit, the Workshop on Education and Bioinformatics, and now we'll have the hackathon later this week at the GOBLET AGM, as well as several Elixir hackathons later in the year. So one thing to point out, these are not standalone events. The organisers of each of these events have worked together to make sure that they are complementary, and that in doing so that we're gathering a diverse perspective of how people are approaching the challenge of verifying their training materials. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to give you a quick overview of the events that have happened so far this year. So the Seneca Hackathon, the Education Summit and the web. And then I'll talk a little bit about what we're planning to do with the GOBLET Hackathon and with the Elixir Hackathons. So the Seneca Hackathon was run for the Seneca project, which is a project that's happening across Canada, Europe, and Africa. And it focused on fairness for cohort data, software, and training materials. In the training materials stream of this hackathon, there were a number of different activities that happened, and they were aimed at identifying common scenarios in sharing training materials and also pulling out some of those pain points that people were encountering in trying to make those materials fair. These activities also built on work from H3A BioNet and the 10 Simple Rules paper to develop a first draft of a fair training materials checklist. So the kind of thing that you might be able to use when you're trying to make your training materials fair, to make sure that you've ticked off all of those boxes and done all the things, but also a way of assessing whether your materials are fair or not. So the next steps coming out of this particular event are to share this checklist with the wider community, which is something that we'll do in the Elixir Hackathon later in the year. If you want to know more about the outcomes of the Seneca Hackathon, there's a really great blog post that Nikki Mulder wrote that you can see here linked on the screen. Next up, we had the Education Summit, and Sarah gave a really good summary about this yesterday, so I won't dwell on it for too long. But to summarise, this brought together people from all over the globe, from multiple countries and multiple settings, and importantly, both from the education and training sectors. There were 3 different days of discussions around different themes, and one of those themes was virtual training now and in the future. In this virtual training discussion, we also touched on how fairness is helping us achieve and take training to a wider audience now that we've gone virtual. Some of the things that came out of it were that many of the people who were there, this was the first time they'd heard about fair training. So there's some work there to do in terms of education and outreach. Many people noted that fair and sharing materials has become more important since moving online. And we also realized that there are quite different needs between countries and settings in terms of what makes materials fair, and also between the education and training sectors. Many people also highlighted that some aspects of fairness have a very steep learning curve, and that there is no one way or one standard way of verifying training materials at the moment. And depending on who you talk to, this is either an advantage or a disadvantage. At the workshop for education in bioinformatics at the ISCB, we again brought together trainers, training coordinators, and educators from across the globe. And we really wanted to use this event to consolidate those challenges that were identified at the CEST Hackathon and the Education Summit, and to brainstorm solutions to these challenges, but also provide a platform for people to share their own experiences. Again, some of the key challenges that came out of this were that people are really keen to do this, but they're not quite sure how to get started. And once they get started, it's hard to tell how fair is fair enough. There's also a need for practical guidance on things, for example, like how to choose a registry, and for using particular tools and platforms like GitHub. Quite a few people also wanted to be able to check before they started how fair their materials were so that they could figure out what they needed to do. The discussions were really fruitful here, and we had lots of great suggestions on how to move this forward, including developing guidance documents, case studies and vignettes, checklists, and for training on verifying training materials. And we will have a report coming out on this fairly soon. Now, to put all this together, this is where the GOBLET Hackathon and the Elixir Hackathons come in. So as you heard from Allegra yesterday, later this week, we'll be using the hackathon at this event to start developing a lesson for making training materials fair and figuring out exactly what people need guidance on and what should go into those lessons. We'll take this forward into the Elixir Hackathon, where we'll develop it further and start to develop training materials to go with those lessons. We also plan to look more closely at that checklist and other tools in the Elixir Hackathon and see how we can develop them further. So that is all I have to share today. Hopefully now you're a little bit more up to date with what's happening in the fair training space. And it's been really exciting to see how the communities really taken this and run with it and developing it for themselves. If you'd like to contribute to the discussions on fair training, do come along to the hackathon later this week. You can also join the Elixir Fair Training Focus Group, which is open to anybody, including people outside of Elixir. I've also put a few links on this slide if you want to know more about the 10 simple rules or any of the events that happened earlier this year. So thanks, and happy to take any questions.